They threw all my belongings in trash bags the day after my husband died, and I realized I was completely alone. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I still remember the moment I stepped through the front door. The smell of my home, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and suffocating. Trash bags were stacked haphazardly on the porch and in the driveway. I could see my favorite clothes, our photo albums, and small keepsakes all crumpled inside the plastic. It was like someone had taken every memory we shared and tossed them away as if they meant nothing. My hands trembled as I touched one of the bags. I couldn't believe Margaret, Daniel's mother, had done this. The woman who was supposed to support me, to grieve alongside me, had instead made me feel smaller than ever. I felt shock, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, and anger bubbled under the surface, but it was accompanied by a deep, aching sadness. I had lost Daniel, the man I loved more than anything, and now the person who should have been my ally made me feel like I didn't belong anywhere. I wandered around the yard, my eyes landing on our garden bench where Daniel and I used to sit and talk about our plans, our dreams. Now it was just another reminder that everything familiar and comforting had been turned against me. The neighbors who once waved and smiled seemed to look away, leaving me with an unbearable sense of isolation. I realized in that moment that I was completely on my own, and no one could protect me from the cruelty that had struck my life so suddenly. Margaret appeared at the doorway, her expression cold and unsympathetic. She didn't offer any comfort or even acknowledge my pain. She said things in a quiet, clipped voice, phrases like I wasn't part of their family or that I didn't deserve Daniel's love. It felt like salt on a wound that was already raw and bleeding. I couldn't understand how someone could be so cruel to a woman who had just lost her husband, who had given everything to this family. Despite the heartbreak and disbelief, a small part of me began to harden. I realized that I couldn't let Margaret's actions define me or dictate my life from that moment on. There was grief, yes, but there was also a spark of something else, a determination that I would find a way to reclaim my life and dignity. Every tear, every pang of betrayal, made me promise that I would survive this, not as a victim, but as someone who could rise above the pain and the cruelty. That day, standing among the trash bags that once held pieces of my life, I made a silent vow to myself. I wouldn't let this betrayal break me. I would honor Daniel by living fully, by proving that no one's selfishness or cruelty could take away the love we shared or the life I still had to fight for. And so, through the heartbreak and the anger, a plan began to form, a quiet, determined resolve to rise from this devastation stronger than ever. I stepped inside the house, hoping somehow Margaret might show a flicker of compassion, but it was immediately clear she had no intention of comforting me. Her eyes were cold, and her tone sharp, like she was delivering a verdict rather than speaking to a grieving daughter-in-law. "You never really belonged here," she said, her words slicing through me. "You weren't family enough for Daniel, and you never will be." I wanted to scream, to argue, to make her understand how wrong she was, but the words caught in my throat. Everything I had done to be part of this family, the love I gave, the plans I shared with Daniel, they all seemed meaningless in that moment. Her dismissal wasn't just cruel, it was calculated, designed to make me feel small and powerless. As I stood frozen, the sound of footsteps drew my attention. Karen, my neighbor from across the street, had been watching the scene from her porch. She hurried over, her face full of concern. "Rachel, I'm so sorry," she said softly. She didn't try to judge or fix things, she just offered a shoulder to lean on, a reminder that not everyone had turned against me. For the first time that day, I felt a small flicker of hope. I wasn't entirely alone. Karen stayed with me as I slowly gathered the trash bags that held my life. She helped me carry a few inside, and as we worked, she reminded me of my strength. "You're stronger than you think," she said. Her words, simple as they were, planted a seed in my mind. Margaret might believe she could control and humiliate me, but I didn't have to accept it. I started to notice how long Margaret had underestimated me. How often she made subtle jabs, questioned my decisions, and acted like I wasn't capable of managing my life. It all clicked together, and suddenly her latest act of cruelty wasn't just a moment of madness, it was part of a pattern. I had been manipulated, belittled, and pushed aside for far too long, and now I could see it clearly. As I sat with Karen later, sipping tea and trying to calm the storm in my chest, a thought began to form. I couldn't let her win. I couldn't allow Margaret's bitterness and greed to control my life or my memories of Daniel. I promised myself then that I would find a way to reclaim my dignity and my life, even if it took time and careful planning. For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt a spark that wasn't just sadness, it was resolve. Margaret might have tried to humiliate me, to make me feel small, but I wouldn't let her. I would rise from this betrayal, and when I did, she would understand that I was stronger and smarter than she ever imagined. That quiet determination settled in my chest, growing alongside my grief, and for the first time, I felt the beginnings of a plan to take back control of my life. I moved into a small apartment not far from my old home. It was modest, cramped even, but it felt like a safe space where I could think without Margaret looming over me. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, and every item I owned seemed carefully chosen to remind me that I was starting over. At first, it felt suffocating. Daniel had always handled the bills, the taxes, the finances, and I had relied on him completely. Suddenly, everything was on me, and the reality of my inexperience hit hard. Paying rent, utilities, and groceries was a struggle. I had never worked outside the home in any serious way, and every expense felt like a mountain I couldn't climb. I was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. Each bill reminded me of how unprepared I had been for life without Daniel. There were nights I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I could make it, questioning how I had allowed myself to be so dependent. But in that struggle, something started to change inside me. One afternoon, while sorting through Daniel's old papers and files, I stumbled across something that made my heart skip a beat. Hidden accounts, small investments, and property deeds, all quietly set up in my name long before he passed. Daniel had planned for this, anticipating that I might one day need security. Margaret had no idea about any of it, which meant she could not touch them. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a spark of determination. This was my lifeline, my chance to reclaim control, and I wasn't about to waste it. I spent hours poring over statements, making lists, calculating what I could do first. I realized that impulsive action would only lead to mistakes. Margaret had underestimated me, and if I wanted to make sure I wasn't hurt again, I had to be careful, patient, and strategic. Each day, I mapped out steps, thinking through finances, legal matters, and the next moves to secure my independence. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was planning, growing stronger in ways I hadn't imagined I could. Even in the small apartment, alone, I felt a shift. The fear that had gripped me when I first lost Daniel began to ease, replaced by a quiet confidence. I started seeing patterns in Margaret's behavior, understanding how she manipulated situations and controlled people. That insight became a tool. If I played my cards wisely, I could protect myself and even turn the tables someday. By the time weeks had passed, the small apartment no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a war room, a place where I rebuilt my strength, assessed my options, and prepared for what was coming. I was no longer just the grieving widow, I was someone who could think clearly, act deliberately, and take back what was mine. The struggle had become my teacher, and each challenge reminded me that I was capable of more than I had ever believed. For the first time, I felt like I was truly in control of my life. I began taking small, quiet steps to reclaim my life. The first thing I did was make sure all my finances were completely under my control. I transferred money into accounts Margaret had no access to and changed passwords and paperwork so that no one could interfere. It felt like I was finally taking back pieces of my life that had been unfairly controlled. Next, I started going through some of the assets Margaret had tried to claim. There were a few small properties and items Daniel had bought or inherited, and I quietly began selling or transferring them into my name. Each transaction felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was no longer powerless. With every step, my confidence grew, and I felt less like a victim and more like someone who could shape her own future. I also took action on smaller things Margaret had tried to manipulate. She had signed me up for certain services, arranged utilities, and made financial commitments without my knowledge. I went through and cancelled what I didn't need, saving money and cutting off her influence. These small acts weren't flashy, but they were deliberate and satisfying. Every move reminded me that I could take control without letting anger make me reckless. Around this time, I reached out to Ethan, a lawyer friend Daniel had trusted. Ethan knew about the estate and the property rights, and he became an essential ally. He helped me understand what I could legally claim, what Margaret had no right to touch, and how to protect myself from any further attempts to manipulate or intimidate me. With his guidance, I began seeing a clear path forward. The legal advice gave me confidence and a sense of security I hadn't felt since Daniel passed. Even as I worked quietly behind the scenes, the tension in me grew. Part of me wanted to confront Margaret directly, to show her that I wasn't someone she could push around. But another part of me understood that patience and strategy would serve me better. Each day, I weighed the choices, thinking carefully about how and when to act. The quiet victories I accumulated were empowering, but I knew the real test would come when I decided whether to face her or continue rebuilding my life without letting her see my moves. Through all this, I noticed a change in myself. I was calmer, sharper, and more determined than before. My grief hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into focus and purpose. I realized that Margaret's attempts to control me had only strengthened my resolve. I was learning that power didn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes, it came from careful planning and taking small but meaningful actions. Every cancelled service, every secured account, every asset reclaimed brought a sense of justice, and I could feel Margaret's influence slipping further away. I was no longer just surviving, I was quietly winning, setting the stage for the day when she would understand that I couldn't be controlled or broken. My life was slowly becoming my own again, and with Ethan's help, I knew I could continue this path safely, building a future that belonged entirely to me. Sometimes, when the apartment was quiet and the city outside hummed softly, my mind wandered back to the early days of my marriage. I remembered the first time I had met Margaret, smiling politely as she inspected the house I had helped Daniel decorate. She made small comments about my choices, like the curtains or the furniture, suggesting I didn't know how to run a home properly. At the time, I laughed it off, thinking she was just particular, but now I could see the pattern. There were dinners when she would make subtle remarks about how I didn't belong, little jabs about my family, or questions about my career, or lack of one, that left me feeling unsure of myself. I remembered how she would check in on us under the guise of concern, but it always felt like a way to assert control, to remind me that no matter what I did, I was still an outsider. Even small favors she offered often came with strings attached, little tests of loyalty that left me second-guessing my own instincts. The flashbacks grew sharper as I recalled holidays and family gatherings. She would criticize my cooking, suggest I didn't understand proper etiquette, or compare me unfavorably to other women in the family. Each comment was tiny on its own, easy to dismiss, but together they formed a quiet, persistent pressure, shaping how I saw myself in her world. It wasn't just her behavior in the present, it was the accumulation of years of subtle manipulation and control that had been building like a slow storm. Sitting alone, I realized how deeply her influence had tried to penetrate my life. But instead of breaking me, these memories fueled a growing determination. I had been patient for too long, bending, adjusting, and trying to earn her approval that would never come. Now, with the clarity of grief and distance, I could see the truth. Margaret's cruelty wasn't just random, it was deliberate and calculated. I made a promise to myself, a vow that settled firmly in my chest. I would show her my strength, but I would not stoop to her level. I didn't want revenge born of anger or meanness, I wanted her to see that I could rise above her manipulations, that I could reclaim my life without losing my dignity. That inner vow became a steady anchor for me. It reminded me that even in the face of betrayal and loss, I had control over how I responded, and my response would define me far more than her actions ever could. As the memories played out in my mind, I felt both pain and power. Pain from years of subtle hurt and resentment, but power from the knowledge that I had survived it all and was beginning to take control. Margaret had underestimated me at every step, and now I understood that her manipulation could no longer touch me. With every memory, my resolve strengthened, and the quiet fire of determination burned brighter. I would move forward, reclaiming what was mine, not with cruelty, but with unwavering strength. One afternoon, while I was sorting through old papers and bills, there was a knock on my apartment door. It was Mark, Daniel's younger brother. I hadn't expected to see him, but the look on his face told me he was here for more than a casual visit. He stepped inside quietly, careful not to draw attention, and we sat down to talk. Mark admitted that he had never liked the way Margaret treated me or even Daniel at times. He told me he had always thought she was controlling and manipulative, but he hadn't known how far she would go until Daniel passed. He had been quietly keeping records of her attempts to control Daniel's property and finances, sensing that she might overstep her boundaries. He slid a folder across the table, and inside were documents showing bills she had tried to redirect, assets she had attempted to claim, and letters that revealed her true intentions. Seeing the proof made my blood boil, but it also gave me clarity. I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. Mark wanted to help, but he also knew that acting recklessly could backfire. Together, we went over every piece of evidence carefully, analyzing what could be used legally and what might not hold up in court. For the first time, I felt like there was a real path forward, not just for reclaiming what was mine, but for ensuring Margaret couldn't harm me or Daniel's legacy again. With Mark's support, I began taking strategic steps. We organized the financial documents, verified ownership of property, and made lists of what Margaret had no right to touch. I reached out to Ethan, my lawyer friend, sharing the new evidence and asking for advice on the best way to protect my assets. It felt like building an invisible shield around myself, one carefully designed so that every move Margaret made could be countered before it caused damage. Working with Mark also gave me a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in weeks. His quiet support and insider knowledge allowed me to see the bigger picture, beyond the grief and anger. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was planning, preparing, and setting the stage for actions that would secure my future. Every discussion with Mark helped me understand where Margaret's weaknesses were and how I could use them without stooping to cruelty. By the end of those days, I felt a shift inside me. The fear and uncertainty that had dominated my life since Daniel's death were slowly being replaced by strategy and determination. I could see the path forward clearly now, and it was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming control, protecting what Daniel and I had built, and showing Margaret that her manipulations would not succeed. With allies like Mark and Ethan, I knew I could navigate the challenges ahead carefully and confidently. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was a woman ready to fight for her life, her dignity, and her future. I started by quietly buying back some of the items Margaret had sold or thrown away. A few pieces of furniture, some of Daniel's belongings, and even small keepsakes that meant the world to me, all returned to my home one by one. Each item felt like a small victory, a symbol that I was reclaiming not just my things, but my dignity and control over my life. It was empowering to see the pieces of my past slowly coming back into my hands, and with them, a growing sense of confidence. Not long after, there was a family gathering at Margaret's house. I knew she would try to humiliate me, to remind everyone that she still had power over me. As soon as I arrived, I could feel her icy stare, the way she whispered under her breath, expecting me to crumble. But this time I refused to show fear or weakness. I walked in calmly, greeting everyone politely, letting her expect the reaction she wanted while keeping my composure intact. During the gathering, Margaret began to make comments about my supposed incompetence, the way I handled Daniel's estate, and even my life without him. Her words were sharp, meant to provoke, but I stayed quiet, letting her speak. Then, carefully and without anger, I began to point out small truths. I mentioned how Daniel had set up accounts and investments in my name, things she had tried to claim, and quietly shared the details with family members. I didn't yell or attack, I simply exposed facts that contradicted her lies. The family's expressions changed. People who had previously remained neutral or unsure began to look at her differently. Margaret's power in the room started to crumble. She had counted on embarrassment and intimidation, but my calm, measured approach allowed her deception to unravel naturally. It was subtle, but effective. I could see the satisfaction in my chest, not from hurting her, but from finally setting the record straight and standing firm. By the end of the evening, Margaret's smug attitude was replaced with a cautious, almost fearful silence. I hadn't shouted, argued, or humiliated her back. I had simply used truth and composure to turn the situation around. It felt like a turning point, a moment where the small, strategic victories I had been building up began to pay off. Walking home afterward, I felt lighter. The emotional weight of Daniel's loss and Margaret's cruelty had not vanished, but the burden of powerlessness had. I had faced her in front of family, kept my dignity intact, and quietly reclaimed respect. That night, I understood that revenge didn't always need to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes, the strongest statement is calm, careful, and precise. Every step I had taken, every small victory, was leading to something bigger, and I felt ready for what came next. While reviewing some of the estate documents with Ethan, my lawyer, I stumbled upon something that made my heart pound and my hands shake. Margaret had secretly tried to rewrite Daniel's will, attempting to remove me entirely from his estate. It was a betrayal I hadn't fully expected, even after everything she had done before. She hadn't just acted out of spite in small ways, she had tried to erase me from Daniel's legacy entirely. The discovery ignited a new determination inside me. This was no longer about small victories or quiet reclamation, it was about defending what was rightfully mine and holding Margaret accountable. With Ethan and Mark by my side, I carefully prepared the legal documents, gathering every piece of proof needed to show her attempts to manipulate and claim what did not belong to her. Every detail mattered, and we went over each one repeatedly, ensuring there would be no loopholes for her to exploit. I arranged a family meeting, inviting everyone who had witnessed Margaret's previous manipulations and who had been part of Daniel's life. I didn't plan to yell or create drama, my goal was to present the truth clearly and calmly. When Margaret arrived, she wore the same smug expression I had seen for years, expecting to intimidate me. But this time, the dynamic had completely shifted. I began by addressing the family, calmly explaining the situation. I outlined, step by step, Margaret's attempts to control Daniel's estate, her secret effort to rewrite the will, and the ways she had tried to manipulate those around us. I presented the documents, letting the facts speak for themselves. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't attack her personally. I simply showed the truth. The effect was immediate. Family members who had once hesitated now looked at Margaret with disbelief and disappointment. The smugness drained from her face as my words and evidence left no room for her to argue or deny the facts. It was a quiet, precise form of justice, one that didn't rely on anger or humiliation but on clarity and truth. Margaret's plan had failed, and it was clear to everyone in the room. I felt a mix of relief and quiet triumph. The betrayal that had cut so deeply now served as the catalyst for a decisive moment in my life. I had faced her directly, used the law and reason to protect myself, and done it with composure and dignity. For the first time, I truly felt in control, not just of the estate, but of the narrative itself. As the meeting ended and family members quietly left the room, Margaret was left alone with the knowledge that her manipulations had been exposed. I walked away with a sense of justice that I hadn't felt since Daniel passed. This moment wasn't just about money or property, it was about reclaiming respect, setting boundaries, and proving that betrayal would not define my life. I had taken the decisive step that ensured my rightful inheritance and, more importantly, affirmed my strength and resilience. Months passed, and slowly but surely, my life began to stabilize. I now owned the house Daniel and I had shared, had full control over his estate, and even managed shares in the family business that Margaret had tried to claim for herself. Each accomplishment felt like a layer of strength added on top of the pain I had endured. The woman who had once thought she could control every aspect of my life was now forced to watch from the sidelines. Margaret realized, perhaps too late, that she had seriously underestimated me. Her smug confidence and attempts to belittle me had only fueled my determination, and now her influence had no power over my life. I noticed the subtle fear and caution in her behavior. She could no longer manipulate or intimidate me. That shift in her demeanor was satisfying, but I focused on it quietly. My goal was never to humiliate her publicly but to assert my life and rights with intelligence and careful planning. With my position secure, I turned my attention to those around me who mattered most. Daniel's nieces and nephews had always been close to him, and I made sure they felt supported and cared for. I helped them with school expenses, encouraged their dreams, and spent time with them whenever I could. Seeing their smiles and knowing I could provide stability for them gave me a deeper sense of purpose. Unlike Margaret, whose cruelty had caused division and fear, I wanted to create an environment of trust, love, and support. Every step I took reinforced the fact that revenge wasn't about anger or spite. It was about reclaiming control, protecting my family, and making sure justice was served without compromising my dignity. I was careful, deliberate, and strategic in everything I did. The estate, the assets, the business shares, they were all tools that helped me regain independence and secure a future for myself and those I cared about. The satisfaction of seeing Margaret realize her miscalculations was quiet but profound. She had counted on fear and manipulation, yet every plan she had laid out backfired because I had remained focused, patient, and thoughtful. I had turned every act of betrayal into an opportunity to grow stronger and smarter. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, and the grief of losing Daniel never disappeared, but I felt empowered in a way I hadn't imagined possible. I had survived cruelty, reclaimed what was mine, and built a life where I was respected and secure. The revenge was complete, not with anger or chaos, but through strategy, patience, and unwavering resolve. As I looked around at the life I had rebuilt, my home, my family, and the trust of those I loved, I knew that true power didn't come from hurting others. It came from understanding, planning, and acting wisely. Margaret's underestimation of me had been her greatest mistake, and I had turned it into my greatest victory. For the first time in months, I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing I had reclaimed my life fully, intelligently, and without ever losing myself. Sitting in the quiet of my home, I often think about everything I went through. Losing Daniel was the hardest thing I have ever faced. The grief was overwhelming, and for a time, it felt like I would never recover. But as I reflect now, I realize that the cruelty I faced from Margaret, the betrayals and attempts to control my life, made me stronger than I ever imagined. Her actions forced me to find strength I didn't know I had, to plan carefully, and to fight for my life with determination and clarity. I've learned to forgive myself for the times I doubted my abilities, the moments I felt weak or overwhelmed. I remind myself that needing support, feeling fear, or struggling doesn't make anyone less capable. What matters is what you do with the strength you find inside yourself. Margaret never deserved my forgiveness, and I don't give it to her, but I don't carry her cruelty inside me anymore. I've set boundaries, reclaimed my life, and moved forward with dignity, and that has given me peace. Life after betrayal is never simple, and the scars remain. But I also see the lessons hidden in the pain. I've learned that betrayal can break a person if they let it, but it can also be a catalyst for resilience. Cleverness, patience, and planning are far more powerful than anger or hasty revenge. By staying true to myself and focusing on rebuilding, I found a way not only to survive but to thrive. I became someone stronger, more confident, and more capable of handling life's challenges than I ever thought possible. I also want anyone listening to remember that strength isn't just about fighting back against those who hurt you. It's about reclaiming your life, protecting your dignity, and taking steps forward no matter how difficult the path feels. It's about making choices that empower you, rather than letting bitterness control you. Every small victory, every decision to act thoughtfully, adds up to something far greater than revenge alone. It becomes your life, your freedom, and your peace. Looking back, I see the journey from fear to empowerment. I see how every challenge, every betrayal, shaped me into someone who can face life confidently, without being broken by cruelty or loss. I've learned that resilience comes from believing in yourself, thinking clearly, and acting strategically. Life may test you, and people may hurt you, but you can rise above it all. So if someone you loved betrayed you, remember this: strength comes not from revenge alone, but from reclaiming your life. Focus on what you can control, protect your dignity, and build a future that belongs entirely to you. In the end, rising above betrayal, with your mind and heart intact, is the greatest victory you can achieve.